Okay. So, good evening, everybody. And today we are going to start on something which we call it as building a platform or a model for Indian darshanas. Okay. Now, we have done a similar exercise previously for what we call it as uh, Greek philosophy, and we had talked about four pillars: metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, these three, and the person in the center. Now, this kind of architecture or structure is not intended in Bharatiya Darshanas for several reasons. One of the reasons for that is the goal for Greek philosophy and the goal for Indian philosophy or Indian darshanas or Indian schools of thoughts, okay, are different. So it was quite natural that the structure which the Indians had selected was quite different, and today we are going to see what that structure is. We are not going to study any darshan to any depth at all. Okay. However, we assume a preliminary understanding of these darshanas, okay, from the audience. We start with something which we call it as a typical Darshanik jargon, and the jargon is something which is the words used in a particular domain. They are normally not used outside these domains, like in standard English, what we call it as a meta language. But these are the words, they have their own different sometimes meaning than the colloquial word. So we have to take it in that particular fashion. So let's have a look at some of these words. What you are seeing on the screen is person and world, that is Jagat. Now, as far as we are going to get into details for each of these, okay, at this moment of time, you can consider them as a random display of the jargon, out of which importance is to Vyakti and Jagat, that is person and world. Now, some of the words I have pushed onto the screen and they are in a different color. Those are calamity, randomness, that is yadruchik, calamity, that is apada, suffering, that is dukkha, and destiny, that is daiva. And these words are particularly very important in Bharatiya Darshanas. Okay. Apart from these words, I will also show you few more words which are in again a different color, which the first pair we call it as Papa Punya or virtue and sin, and the second pair we call it as soul and flame, okay, which is nothing but flame we are using the word for Chit Shakti, and soul we are using for Atma. So these words which I had previously flashed and the words which I have flashed in green, there is a difference. And that difference is that the words which I have flashed in green are something which we call it as para notions. Okay, they do not belong to the physical world, they are the para notions in a particular darshana. So we keep that differentiation in mind when we go ahead. Now, in all, we have somewhere around 10 darshanas. Dasha darshana is not a standard term because Shat darshana is a term. Then there are four more darshanas which have an equal right to be there in to be grouped under Dasha darshanas, and those are Charvakism, Charvaka, Ajaivik, Bauddha, Jain. These are the four darshanas which have to be added to the Shat darshanas, and then we have the normal Shat darshanas, which are Sankhya Yoga, then Nyaya and Vaisheshik, and then Mimamsa and Vedanta. This is, we know at least this much, and only this much is at this moment of time expected from the audience. Now we move forward now, and then we look for how do we build from these words, how can we build systems. So the terms, that is jargon, can be related to a particular darshan by a common theme or a structure. This structure is in systems language, which we call it as model. So each darshana, according to me, is a model. The model to study darshana is a triad: the trigger, the object of pursuit, and the method of pursuit. To make it short, it is trigger, object, and method. This is the triad which is used to describe any Indian darshan. And that's quite meaningful. And this method is quite useful in describing each darshan and any darshan. This model was pretty well for studying a particular darshan. Okay. But what we are interested is not in studying an individual darshan. That's not the aim of this presentation or episode at all. What we are interested in is a comparative study of darshanas. Then which model should we use? That's the question. So this is the exact topic of today's episode. Now, in order to understand this episode, some background is essential, and that background I had already published onto the YouTube channel. If you have not seen this previously, probably you may look at each of these three videos. These are very short videos. One is for what we call it as the whole on, the other is world of worlds, and the third is language of levels. The model which we are going to build is a systems model, and that system in essence has got its own terminology, it has got its own jargon, and what that jargon is aptly described in these three short videos. If you haven't done that, probably you can have a look at that on my YouTube channel. Now, what I will do is, assuming that you have not done that, I will describe them what they mean in a few sentences. The I, the whole on, correspond to a very important concept in systems theory. We know of objects, we know of processes, and so on and so forth. A holon is a special kind of an object which is a part of something and which also has parts. So it has a dual face. Okay, it has an environment where components are acting. It has an environment in which this particular object is a part. So this is the kind of the structure of holon. This is very important to understand. Then, since the holon has a structure, environment and environment, okay, and the holon itself, okay, we have three levels at this moment. Okay, there is a language which corresponds to the holon. There is a language which corresponds to the environment of the holon, and there is a language which corresponds to environment of the holon. And these languages have to be different, because the same language cannot be used at all the three levels. It is, so to say, a troublesome affair to use the same language. That's aptly described in what we call it as language of language and language of levels. And world of worlds, similar to language of levels, we have the world also comprised of levels: level 0, level 1, level 2, and so on, like also level -1, level -2, and so on. So this is the kind of the holarchy or the hierarchy which is going to be used in building the model for the Indian darshanas. We'll start with the most important object, okay, of the real world, which is a person. So we'll look at the characteristics of the person and the karmic residue which the person possesses. Now, the person has a body, okay, and it has got some characteristics. So the physical body of the person is the object, while the other characteristic, other things which I am showing, they are either gunas or qualities of that particular object, which is vyakti, say for example. So he is a knower, he is a doer also. It is not that he only knows, he can do things also. This essentially means when a person we are describing is a knower as well as doer, we call him as an agent. He has a capability to understand things and also to change things. Now, if he has the capacity to know and to change, okay, he has got certain kinds of instincts, and these instincts correspond to something which we call it as drives, which are biological drives. That means when somebody is hungry, he will hunt for food, and some of them are pursuits, okay, and this is a very important characteristic of an agent, like a conscious agent, like a human being, that he sets himself for a pursuit and acts in this particular fashion. Now, drives and pursuits are something by which he gets into something which we call it as karma, which we will see a little later. Apart from this, when we are talking about a person in the physical world, we are using the dark border here. Okay. Now, when that person is considered in darshanas, apart from these four entities which we talked about, we attach to him something which is called as soul, which is Atma, and Chit Shakti, that is flame. Now, these two things are not to be mistaken for what we call it as consciousness. Consciousness is quite different. Soul and Chit Shakti are beyond consciousness. That's something which one has to keep it in mind when we are using the person or the sthula vyakti. Okay, and apart from that, he possesses a kind of a memory which we call it as a sanchit or residue of virtue and sin, or papa and punya. So when we talk about a person in the Darshanik terms, this is the baggage it carries. Now, since we are going to build a model, we are going to abstract this representation which we have seen in detail to something which is shown on the right, which we call it as sthula sharir. Okay, and
15 वर्ष कामों के लिए लोगों
hello, we call it as sthula sharir, and we also along with sthula sharir, we call something as sukshma sharir. The difference between these two is sthula sharir is a physical entity.
आपण
Sukshma
तुला
sharir,
वाढून घे म्हणजे थोडा शांतीला ठेवता येईल.
हो कळलं आणि डॉक्टरने तुमचे डॉक्टर आता हो इथली खरं काम आहे बेसिकली सीरियस.
hello, no talk please. And then sukshma sharir, okay, which is quite different, and this is something, this is a concept which you have to discuss in detail when we go to something which we call it as punarjanma or rebirth cycle. So we will use these two as the symbols for that. One is a physical person and the other is a sukshma sharir or linga sharir as it is called in Indian darshanas. Now, to build a model, okay, and to make models to fit well into a screen, we are, so to say, abstracting the symbols. So papa punya will abstract to a simple symbol of green and red. Obviously green will mean punya and the sin will mean pap. So we have described one object, or rather one agent, which is accepted by all darshanas, all Indian darshanas. We now look at the the other entity or the other object which is also accepted by all darshanas, and this we call it as world or jagat. What we have in the world is a physical world, and since I have shown a dark boundary around it, this means it is physical. We can talk about many things in the physical world, but we will specifically restrict to object which we call it as achetan vastu and agents which we call it as sachetan vastu. And apart from these, we all are aware that there is something which is called as randomness in this world. Okay, things change beyond the control either of the nature or of the psyche, and we call these changes occurring of that particular kind as yadruchik changes. And destiny, that is daiva, that means which change will occur for whom, when and why, okay, is not known. That we call it as destiny or daiva. Now, apart from this, here is a brief representation of what is going to be considered as Jagat in Darshanik terminology. We have the people here, which are the agents or Sachetan Vastu. We have the objects like a cave and other things. And apart from this, there is something which we call it as calamity or apada and suffering, that is dukkha. Now, why these words are important will become aptly clear as we go along. Okay, but we will show that these are the words which are used or are the triggers for generating the darshanas. Now, apart from this, in the physical world, we have to consider two more entities. One is birth, that is Janma, and other is Mrityu. So this comprises what we call it as world or Jagat. Now, if you look at this, okay, as we had said, Jagat, for example, is a whole on because we will show that Jagat is a part of something higher, and Jagat has what we see here as the parts, like the parts being the Achetan Vastu, Sachetan Vastu, Yadruchik, that means properties like Yadruchik, Daiva, Dukkha, Apada, and so on, and Janma and Mrityu. So this has got properties and it has got components. So it has got an environment. We will later see that Jagat becomes a part of the model, part of a Darshanik model. So that would be its environment. Now we'll concentrate on something which is commonly used in all the darshanas, and we'll call that as karma chakra or karmic loop. Now here, if you look at the on the left side, if you look, I have used the symbol for our Vyakti or person. Okay. And in the center here, I have shown that it is karma. And it is the drives and pursuits. Okay. And the capability of a person as a doer, okay, he is in a position to do karma. For why he is doing a karma, okay, is a different story at this moment of time, but he is doing a karma. And before he does any karma, okay, or any act, okay, he has here, as shown here, a what we call it as a sanchit, papa punya sanchit. Then when he has done that karma, it could be a sukarma or kukarma, as the case may be. What happens is then that karma updates the sanchit of papa and punya. And when this happens, okay, this is a forward path, but this does not end because a human being or a conscious human being is continuously engaged in acting or doing karma. So there is a feedback, and that feedback comes. And now what happens is that the previous karma, okay, which has updated his sanchit, okay, becomes the next level, and this continues from birth to death. So we call this as this is the first loop that we talk about in darshanas. We call that as a karmic karma chakra or karmic loop. We'll abstract this also and will not discuss any further than this, but note that this object which we have created has physical components, okay, has something which is called as drives and pursuits, okay, which are properties, Okay, and then it is going to update something like Papa and Punya and so on and so forth. So this is an object. This is again a holon in itself. Now we move further and we look at what we call it as a karmic trajectory. What happens is we have the Jagat as we have talked about, and then we have the karma loop, which I have embedded in the Jagat. As it is embedded, it is indeed embedded in the physical world. And then we have abstracted here Janma and Mrityu. So what happens is at birth, from birth he starts doing karma and continues to do karma, okay, not the same, different kinds, and updates, keeps on updating the sanchit, and a time comes when the person dies, and that is the death. Okay, so now we have got a model, because now we have put together two objects, okay, one called as the karmic loop inside the jagat, and the janma and the mrityu, and then there are the properties, and we have a structure here which we call it as a model. Okay. This is a new holon that we have created. Now, after we have created this holon, two natural questions arise, okay, in mind. And the first question is, what happens to the person or to the sthula sharir, okay, after death? And the second question is, okay, why in the first place, where from he is born? So if we say that my model is restricted only to the one which is shown on the screen, then these questions remain unanswered. So to answer these questions, we have to update or extend or augment our model. Let's see in what way this model can be augmented. When this model is augmented, we call that as a rebirth loop. And this is the second loop or second cycle that is continuously taking place, like a karma cycle. This is the second cycle which is taking place. And here what happens is, okay, after death, the sukshma sharir, okay, which is shown in two thin lines for the square boundary, okay, because it's not physical, okay, moves along with something which we call it as the chit shakti, the sanchit, and the atma. Okay, this is the there are variants in this, but we will look, we will propose create, and we will see how each darshana modifies this, and then we have a rebirth. So this is a cycle which keeps on happening, and this is what we call it as the rebirth or janma marana mrityu phera. This is known as the phera which we talk about. So this is the birth cycle. Now again the questions still arise, and we have no answers which are given by this model. And what are those questions then? The first question is, what happens, okay, after death? Is it that it is an infinite loop that an entity will be circulating, once a sthula sharir, then sukshma sharir, then sthula sharir, and so on and so forth, ab infinitum, ad infinitum? Is this so? This is a question which will naturally occur. And this leads us to the next layer of what we call it as holonic layer. What we have done is, from the previous this thing, we have created a new layer also, which is this rebirth loop. This is again a holon. Now, so we go, when we go to the karmic liberation, okay, we have a holon abstracted, okay, and then we have something which we call it as mukti, okay, and this is what we call it as liberation or mukti. Now looks that we have solved one problem, answered one question which was kept unanswered in the previous model, and we have augmented the model to something which is called as liberation or mukti. But do the questions end here, or are there any questions left? If any question is left, we call that as a philosophical residue. That means that model is not complete. And what we are looking for is a complete model which will not leave any question unanswered. That is the aim that we have got in building models, that means darshanas. So that question which remains unanswered is prathama janma. Prathama janma means that we have said that a entity which is recirculating through the uh, rebirth loop will eventually get liberated. Okay, but what in the first place? From where did this entity come into these circles at all? So that question remains unanswered. Okay, that means we have to update our model to answer that particular question. So let's look at that, how we answer or how the darshanas answer. I am at this moment of time not talking about any particular darshan. What we are doing is we are building a probable model which will be in a position to help us understand where those darshanas stand in this universal model. So we have again abstracted our holon back, which has got entities like स्थूल शरीर, सूक्ष्म शरीर, mukti, prathama janma, karma, and so on and so forth. Okay, we have abstracted that, and since the questions had been still possible, okay, we are going to augment this model, and this we call it as a augmentation of, this is known as a atma loop. Okay, and it goes into something which we call it as a Brahmic loop. So here, this is it. What happens is that after mukti, actually what happens is nothing like liberation, but mukti is not in that particular sense. You have to take it in terms of salvation or moksha. And what happens is when there is a salvation or moksha, okay, the atma gets one with an entity called as universal entity called as Brahman or Brahman, which has got an associated entity which is normally called as Maya. Okay, and it is the Brahman which, so to say, absorbs the Atma after moksha and creates a new one. So it has got an absorption cycle and it has got a Srujan cycle. And this is the Srujan limb through which Prathama Janma occurs. Now, it looks that we have answered everything, but not quite so, because there are still some questions which are left unanswered. And these are, say, for example, okay, where in the first place the world come into being? Okay, that question we can still ask. Okay, and to answer that, we have to add one more loop over this, which we call it as the loop of Brahmic loop of Jagat. And what it does is, on this, it adds something which we call it as creation, that is nirmana of the Srushti, and vinash, that is extinction of the Srushti. And then this is all done by Brahma and Maya. Okay, so under those circumstances, probably we have answered all questions, probably, okay, except one, as to why in the first place these loops came into action or creation. Why did Brahma create these loops? Now we are at something which we call it as the dead end of the model. What it means is, what the dead end means is that the answer to this is just far no more. This means that ekoham bahusyam prajayet. That means what Brahma thought was he or she or what it, whatever it is alone, okay, and hence it wanted to become many. So one many, that is ekoham bahusyam prajayet or bahusyam bhavami. Okay, so that's what we have. So probably the model for all possible darshanas, Indian darshanas, we have been able to create. Now we are not fit any kind of a darshana in this particular model. So let what we are going to do now is we are going to show where do the darshanas stand vis-a-vis the model which we have created. So we start first. Okay, first is the Charvaka. You have seen this on the screen now, and we have a Charvaka, and we have a model here which starts with Janma or birth and ends into death, and the only loop it has got is what we call it as the karmic loop. And here the model ends, the Charvakian darshan or philosophy ends. Okay. Now, what about other darshanas? So let's see what happens to other darshanas. We are going to show all the 10 darshanas in one shot on the screen. Now there is a group of darshanas which we call it as Vipaka Darshana, not a standard terminology in any way in the darshanas. Vipak terminology means karma vipak technology where rebirth is assumed. Okay. Now, in this model which I have shown here, where only question which has not been answered is Prathama Janma, but up to Mukti, this is a model which has been used by Ajivik Tattvajnan, Buddhism, sorry, Buddhism, Jainism, Mimamsa, Sankhya, Yoga, Vaisheshik, and Nyaya. All of them fall in this particular category. Okay, they are rebirth loops and liberation. Okay, that is the model which is applicable to all these darshanas. Now, when we look at these particular darshanas, they are obviously different. Okay, that means they are different, but they are different in what we call it as content, not in structure. They pertain to the same structure, same model. Their contents might be different. Say, for example, if we look at the Ajaivik model, okay, in case of an Ajaivik, the sthula or sukshma sharir which I have shown here, okay, which had a flame that is Chit Shakti, Atma, and Sanchit. Okay, it is not like this. This component is different when we look at the Ajaivik model. What it assumes for this particular component is that there is no Chit Shakti, there is no Atma, there is no Sanchit. Okay, this box is then named by a different word. It is called as Niyati. And the Ajaivik Tattvajnan says that everything is predestined. Okay, how long you will be taking rebirth and when you will get into mukti is all pre-written, okay, by Daiva. Okay, so this particular part in the model changes in its connotation content, but the structure still remains the same. When we go to Buddhism, okay, Buddhism for Buddhism, this particular structure still holds, exactly holds, the structure exactly holds. Okay, for example, when we come to something which we call it as the karmic loop, is a series of karmic loop, and then the rebirth is also considered as what is known as continued. There is a term for that. Okay, that it's a continuous loop that is taking place of karmas and this thing, but the what we call it as a sukshma sharir, which is recirculating through births, okay, is not like this. What it is in case of Buddhism is that this particular small blue circle, which we have termed it as Atma, vanishes. It is no Atma there. Buddhism is anatma, no self. But there is a chit shakti and a sanchit associated with it. Okay, that is circulating. We are not discussing here or debating here. Okay, how the hell can this be? Okay, these are what we call it as the greatest debates on in Indian darshanas. but this is what is assumed as to what is circulating. So that forms the Buddhism. Otherwise, Buddhism, instead of calling it as mukti, will call it as nirvana. But these are only words. Okay, what is meant is that it is a terminal point. Nothing further happens. Either the sthula sharir with atma and chit shakti is vanished, okay, and nothing has remained. We have gone into something which is called as cessation of everything. And since there is a cessation of everything, there is a cessation of what we call it as the sufferings also. So that is the Buddhism. When we go to Jainism, there is a little difference. And that difference is Jainism assumes that Atma is there. And the picture which is shown here with Atma, Chit Shakti, and Sanchit circulates. That is what happens. And then they call the termination or liberation point, okay, they call it as Siddhatva. Okay. But it's a different word. Okay, apart from that, that means in content things are changing, but they are not changing in the structure at all. Then next we go to Mimamsa, okay, and Sankhya and Yoga and Vaisheshik and Nyaya. Okay, to a certain extent, they also follow the same thing. As far as Mimamsa, Sankhya, Yoga, Vaisheshik, Nyaya, and what we call it as the Vedanta, okay, Vedanta, leave it Vedanta part, up to Nyaya, this model in total remains same. What changes under those circumstances in these things is what we call it as the methods of liberation. Okay, how to get liberated, that particular part of it changes, but this structure remains the same. Now, the only darshan which we have not covered up till now is what we call it as a Vedanta. And Vedanta has got this particular full-fledged blown model. And this is what is the structure or model which Vedanta uses. And obviously, okay, all inner models are a part of it. This is a holon. Okay, so the holonic chain is starting from karmic loop to rebirth loop to what we call it as a Atma recirculation loop to Jagat recirculation. Okay, so this is what we call it as Vedanta Darshan. Okay, and thus if you see that each darshan corresponds to a part of this Brahmic model or more parts of the Brahmic model and so on and so forth. So the only thing which changes is the structure does not change. All darshanas were able to fit into a standardized structure, okay, and only the contents and methods of the darshanas change. For example, as far as the methods are concerned or objects are concerned, object of that particular darshana is concerned, okay. For example, we talked about a trigger point for a darshana and the end point for or the what we call it as the pursuit, okay, for the darshana. So as far as Charvaka is concerned, the pursuit is what we call it as pleasure. For Ajaivika, it is cessation of sorrow. For Buddhism, it is nirvana. For Jainism, it is moksha or liberation or siddhatva. For Sankhya, it is kaivalya. Okay. For yoga, it is samadhi. For nyaya, it is apavargam. For Vaisheshika, it is moksha. Okay, and for what we call it as Mimamsa, it is Swarga, and for Vedanta, it is Moksha. Moksha occurs many times. Okay, so these are the words. But okay, when we talk about, say, for example, when we talk about Nyaya Darshan, okay, it means liberation only. Okay, but the reason, okay, of being into the rebirth circle is different, okay, which is called as ajnana, not a proper knowledge. Aprama. Aprama is the reason why a soul, okay, and its chit shakti, along with its sanchit, is in the loop, okay, because it is uh, wrong understanding, okay. So it's the, as far as the nyaya is concerned, it is logic to liberation. As far as vaisheshika is concerned, it is understanding the physical nature of the world and you being a part of the world. So from ajnana to jnana, that is to, for vaisheshika it is moksha or liberation. So these are the interpretations will change for the boxes, but the structure will remain the same. So this is what we call it as the uh, model to compare different types of darshanas. Now, one point up till now which we have not discussed at all was something which we call it as God, and the darshanas which believe in rebirth and no rebirth also, like Charvaka. From Charvaka to something like Sankhya, there is no God coming into picture in description in terms of content of that darshan at all. But there is God in darshanas, okay, which are also rebirth darshanas, okay, but the God is has a specific property. For example, in case of yoga, the God is, or the Ishvara is special Purusha, because yoga darshana consists of essentially abstracted Sankhya in terms of Purush and Prakriti. That means two components. And in case of Sankhya Darshan, Mukti comes when we understand that Purush is different from Prakriti. Prakriti is short lived, Purush is long lived. Okay, this is all that there is to it in Sankhya Darshan. When it comes to yoga, okay, it is the God is considered, or Ishwar is considered as a special Purusha. When it comes to Vaisheshika, Ishwar is considered as a material cause of creation and annihilation. Okay, that's what Nyaya Darshan considers. It's a material cause of all loops coming into picture. When it comes to Nyaya Darshana, it is known as the efficient cause. There is something which is called as these two terms, like material cause and efficient cause, okay, are come from something which we call as epistemology. And to make the understanding a little bit more clear at this point, is that consider a potter, okay, and he is shaping clay into a pot, okay. So the material cause is the clay and the wheel and other things. This is a material cause, while the efficient cause is the potter itself, because it is he who is guiding the process. So this we can talk at length later. We are going to talk at length when we go to Phragmosophy as what kinds of causes are there, okay, or influences are there. But this is what is meant in case of darshanas. The gods are not gods which are personal gods in any way. The way that one, okay, who fulfills your wishes. Okay, not of that kind. The Ishvara is not of that kind. And the Ishvara in Vedanta is ultimate cause. Okay, so Ishvara is subsumed in what we call it as Brahma. So this is an overview of what we call it as the all the darshanas, how they fit into a single model. Okay, and we will now, to a certain extent, we have come to the end of what I wanted to discuss today. We'll gloss through some of the slides further. Okay, here we'll look at the Darshanik comparisons. Okay, so we have the Charvaka, okay, where the root cause or the trigger for the darshana, okay, is something which we call it as suffering in life. Okay, goal or ultimate aim is seizure from suffering. Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. Where at Charvaka, it is pleasure, that is maximum sensory enjoyment. And as far as the key para notions are concerned, there is no para notion involved in Charvaka at all. Para notion means beyond physical. Okay, only pratyaksha, that is direct perception, rejects soul, karma, and God. Okay, so that's what Charvaka is. Then Ajaivika lacks awareness, okay, for the person. I mean, lack of awareness, okay, that is the root cause. Then cessation of all sorrow is predetermined liberation. Okay, there is nothing like the sthula sharir is not supposed to influence the karmic loop at all. It is not in his hands how to move papa or punya, if at all. So there is no concept of papa or punya because it is all niyati. So it is key para notion is niyati, fate or cosmic determination as the supreme principle. When we come to Buddhism, okay, Trishna or craving or attachment leading to dukkha, suffering, okay, is the root cause, root trigger for developing that darshana. The ultimate goal was nirvana, that is cessation of suffering and extinction of cravings. And the key para notions used were only, as we call it as, there is no permanent self and there is what we call it as kshanikatva, that is nothing is constant, momentariness, okay, is what is assumed in key para notions. Okay, atma is not assumed, it is no atma or anatma. Okay, when we go to something which we call it as a Jaina darshan, okay, it is accumulation of karma, which is subtle matter on the jiva soul. That means what happens is that the sanchit, the papa punya as atoms cling to atma, okay, and do not allow the atma to liberate. This is what is the root cause. If you have to understand that and you have to release the connection between the sanchit, okay, and what we call it as the atma and chit shakti, and you get into something which we call it as the ultimate aim of being siddha. And the key para notions which are used here are no absolutism, that is anekantavad, that is a different thing, okay, not considered in this model. There is this is details, jiva and ajiva, that is non-consciousness. When we come to other darshanas, okay, which are Avedic darshanas, we have finished. Now we come to Vedic darshanas, okay. We can similarly look into that. Sankhya is the root cause is what we call it as avivek between Purush and Prakriti, which means that you are not in a position to understand that Purush is permanent, Prakriti is temporary, and they are different. Okay, the goal is Kaivalya or isolation of Purush from Prakriti, that is Kaivalya, and key para notions are Purusha and Prakriti. Okay, Purusha corresponding to consciousness and Prakriti corresponding to what we call it as the matter, nature, desires, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then when we come to yoga, it is chitta vritti, okay, fluctuations of the mind stuff. Okay, that is the root cause. Okay, why we are in the not only in the karmic loop but in the rebirth loop. The liberation, that is goal of liberation, is achieved in samadhi or kaivalya, cessation of chitta vrittis. Okay, and the key para notions are systemized. It systemizes Sankhya, introduces Ishvara here as an aid to focus on the liberation. Okay, and it uses an Ashtanga limb, eight limb mechanism, and so on. We have not listed any. We are not listing in any mechanisms as to how to do it. Okay, then we come to Vaisheshika, which corresponds to the root cause being the ignorance of the true nature of padarthas. Padarthas means categories like dravya, guna, okay, properties, matter, and so on. And this is ignorance of them, not understanding this at all. not understanding the metaphysics at all, metaphysics of matter and mind at all. That's Vaisheshika. The goal is moksha again and cessation of suffering, but this is through knowledge, knowledge of how the metaphysics operates. So Vaisheshika is essentially metaphysics oriented. Okay. And then key paranotions are Parmanu, that is atomism, and seven padarthas, categories of existence. When we come to Nyaya, it is what we call it as the Mithya Jnana or Aprama, as normally called, false knowledge or delusion. And the goal is to get a right knowledge or prama, and then the end point of this is apavarga or moksha, sometimes called as moksha also. Okay, and it focuses on something which we call it as pramanas, that is means of valid knowledge, perception, inference, comparison, and testimony. And Nyaya, to describe it in one sentence, is something like liberation through logic. While in case of Vaisheshika, it is liberation through understanding the Sthula Sharir or Sthula Jagat. Then Mimamsa is a little different from all of them. It is related to Karma Kanda, and it is like deviating from Dharma, that is Vedic rituals, okay, gives rise to what we call it as Papa. And Papa increase means you are in rebirth. So what you have to do is when you do right, to say, follow right dharma, right rituals, okay, you get into heaven or swarga or moksha or whatever you call it. It is sometimes mimamsa tatvanya, mimamsa stream has got goal of swarga. Here that swarga is another thing which happens. It's not liberation in that particular sense. Liberation were into swarga. Okay, and it's an absolute authority of Vedas. Okay, Karma Kanda focuses on dharma and apurva, that is unseen ritual power. And lastly, we have Vedanta, uh, which is avidya or maya. That means Brahman is, so to say, uh, not clear to an Atman. Okay, Atman means there are two terms. Atman means one entity which Sthula Sharir holds from a part of the Brahman is in Sthula Sharir called as Atman. And that Atman is not understanding Brahman because of the avaran or enclosure of Maya. That is the root cause. And from that, assuming that as a root cause, the darshana is developed, and its goal is to get into moksha, which is nothing but salvation. Okay, as we have already seen, and Brahman key paranotions are ultimate reality, Atman, impression of the open, I mean, and so on and so forth. So if you look at each of these darshanas, okay, uh, each of them uses paranotions. Okay, so if you look at this um, Charvaka Darshana, there is zero paranotion. And if you look at Vedanta, there are many paranotions. And in between these two extremes, there are varying numbers of paranotions, but nonetheless, they are there. Okay, so if you remember the first slide, okay, where I had shown that Papa Punya and Chit Shakti and Atma and so on, which were the paranotions, I mean, which almost all darshanas are using. That finishes our presentation on what we call it as the building a model for darshanas, which where we can show where each of the darshana fits. It is not, again I stress, this is not for studying a particular darshan. This model is for studying all possible darshanas. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this Pragmasapi, as I call it, is a Prajna Yajna. And please subscribe my channel, visit to my website, and you will be able to get something which we call it as actionable knowledge and systemic thinking. With that, I think I come to the end of the presentation.